Hi, everyone, and welcome to this podcast on burnout with Reine DuBois, a naturopath from the Health Lodge in Byron Bay, and Dr. Chris Stevens from drchris.life. We're really keen to interview Dr. Chris on this subject. He's been a psychologist with over 25 years' experience developing organisational capabilities for what he calls the virtuous circle of creativity, high performance, and well-being. And Dr. Stevens' work is concerned with the chronic stress, accelerated pace, and the extended workplace hours and responsibilities and its impact on creative thought and well-being. Dr. Stevens has consulted at all levels in a very wide range of organisations around the world. So again, we're really keen to get his understanding of the sorts of pressures people are under in these sorts of environments and the sorts of risks there are in becoming burnt out. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Reine DuBois and Chris Stevens. So please enjoy this podcast on burnout, and I hope you find it helpful. And if it raises any questions for you, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at the Health Lodge. So, Chris, I was wondering, from your work experience and perspective, whether you could share some examples of some high achievers you've worked with who have really presented with burnout, have really experienced burnout.
Yes, as you know, unfortunately, it's a pretty common experience. So typically the people I work with are fairly senior in the corporate world. The typical sort of person is a person who's been very successful. Their success is quite public, so they have very high status in their field. And there's different, we'll get to this, there's different causes of them burning out. There's quite a broad phenomenon, but typically they've made some sort of stuff up. It's this feeling like this whole edifice is going to fall down, right? But typically the stuff up is usually not that bad. It's more indicative of the effects, the gradual effects of burnout. They've been burning out, not really realizing they're burning out, right? But these are people who work prodigiously. They have a kind of work ethic that makes the rest of us just feel pretty slack and lazy, right? Shall we just go on to what their characteristics are? Would that be helpful?
It would be. Perhaps before that, in terms of sort of examples, because you talked about people that you've worked with, what sort of fields are they in?
I could say
responsibilities do they have? Yeah.
So there'd be people who are very senior lawyers in top-tier law firms, international law firms. So they'd be litigators, or they'd be in corporate, where they're usually working on very big deals, very public. CEOs of corporations in finance or in education, where, again, the work demands are extraordinary, but this high visibility. But also burnout's increasingly been seen, I'm seeing it in more junior roles, where people are highly ambitious, highly driven. They're in a work culture and an environment that's very punitive, very driving. So, in terms of that you'll be no doubt aware of, they may be in a culture that's not psychologically particularly safe, where everyone around you is seemingly bulletproof, and they're all working like crazy as well. So whereas earlier in my career, it was mostly people at that very high level, increasingly now I'm seeing it sort of, it's an unfortunate example of the trickle-down effect, only this time it's the trickle-down effect of burnout. And anecdotally, I don't know whether it's true, but I suspect it is post-COVID, like during COVID and post-COVID. I think there is a bit more of a tendency for burnout with the working from home phenomenon, because people aren't getting the moderating influences of physically being around other people. So I think that they're getting lost in their own minds, as it were. They're not connecting with people. So I think that's probably another new element in an old story.
We were touching on the personality traits and characteristics of these people that work incredibly hard, achievers. Can we talk into that more, Chris?
Yeah, well, if we're say talking the big 5 personality traits, the obvious one is conscientiousness. Typically, people, especially if they're high achievers who are burning out, are very high in conscientiousness. So, what's driving them there is a natural, born with tendency to put what I call worst case scenario thinking. They are seeing problems that could emerge 10 miles down the road, and they make sure it doesn't happen. So therefore, they're high achievers, they're highly productive, but the necessary adjunct to that is worry, right? So conscientiousness is always very high. There's a couple of the big 5 that if you have those in addition, you're going to be much more prone.
Okay.
So if a person's relatively high on neuroticism or low on emotional stability, it's like a type of emotional amplifier. They're going to have higher amplitude negative emotions internally of more frequency. And the third is if a person's highly agreeable. It's a lovely trait. But if a person is very high in agreeableness, they're going to worry a lot about whether people like them, and they're going to be much more inclined to self-criticism and to doubting self. So any kind of slip up in any kind of crack in the edifice, especially if it's super high conscientiousness, they're going to be the people that will be working desperately to maintain a sense of their position in the affections of those around them. I should just say one other thing I think that's important here is that sitting alongside personality is, which is basically a way that we're all different, right? The various dimensions, the way we're different. The thing we've all got in common as Homo sapiens is this inevitable and unavoidable desire for status. And so one way of understanding life is that it's just constant pursuit for various forms of status. And when people are very successful, they've attained very high status. It's hard to exaggerate the threat they feel when that status is threatened. And I think this is a major cause of high achiever burnout. So, that one mistake, if it becomes public, the scales are going to fall off everyone's eyes. They're going to see that I'm a phony, that I'm not as good. And the trust that everyone has bestowed in me is going to vanish overnight. So it's a bit like, the fragility and the vulnerability of the influencer on social media or the star who, the feeling is it's going to all unravel. So that's all of these personality features are in service of that universal game that we're all engaged in, and that is this need. And I don't think we can avoid it, this need for status.
That's really interesting, Chris. If anybody's watching this and go, okay, this is kind of adding up to my kind of personality, and I want to turn this question to you as well, Ren. What are the kind of red flags and warning signs that they, or perhaps it might be it might be one of us standing here, what do we need to pay attention to? What are the indicators that burnout is ensuing, or in fact they're in that place? I might start with you, Chris, and then I'm really interested in your perspective, Ren.
Well, if we're talking about a kind of comprehensive exhaustion, right? So it's typically across psychological, physical, mental, emotional. There's a sense of deep fatigue. But the way it's going to manifest, in my experience, the way it manifests is very different across people, right? But I think the thing is, there's this sort of marked decline relative to a person's normal operational ability. So they normally can concentrate, they just can't follow a thread of thought. They normally sleep well. They can't sleep. They normally super motivated to go to work. They can't drag themselves out of bed. They're normally really calm. They're finding themselves crying. And you know, we could multiply these things. They normally like people. Now they're finding themselves irritable. So like with mental health generally, there's this sort of general decline relative to their normal standard. But I think the key thing is they've worn themselves out, and they don't realize it sort of creeps up on them. They're becoming slowly habituated to less and less capability until it gets to a point and they really stuff up something, or it's just like some switch has been turned. In the old days, we used to talk about nervous breakdowns. And it's a bit like that. This is not a diagnosis, burnout. But that's my sense. But what do you think, Reine?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I agree. It's not a diagnosis, burnout. It's a syndrome. And so with all syndromes, it's usually a set of symptoms, but they may not be exactly the same in everybody. And so, Chris, like you say, there's usually a lot of physiological symptoms leading up to it. The fatigue is one of them. Just that deep bone tiredness that, you know, when we are seeking status, or we are under the pump, or we are under stress, we can kind of override it with adrenaline for a while, until the adrenals find themselves just unable to keep pumping that adrenaline. Now, adrenaline's a dirty chemical. The body doesn't like it long term. We're built for stress on, stress off, short periods of time on a physiological level. And if, you know, it's stress on and stress on and stress on and stress on, they're maladaptive stressors. And through evolution, I'm sure we will adapt to dealing with levels of stress on constantly. But physiologically, we haven't adapted yet as a species to have that constant stress on, stress off. So the big impact on a physiological level is we see that cortisol kicking in, high levels of cortisol, which interferes with insulin, which interferes with the energy production, the mitochondria. And then we'll start to see things like weight gain, very, very fast weight gain, or very, very fast weight loss. And so both can be attributed. Obviously, we see the insomnia is big, and people will often medicate their insomnia. So they'll have a few extra drinks before bed. Physiologically, they're going to sleep dehydrated, another attack on those cells. They'll start to look more aged, not as youthful as they once looked. There'll always be gut symptoms. So there'll always be loss of appetite or comfort eating, heading for those carbs. We'll also see either diarrhea or constipation. So there'll always be some sort of, because the vagal nervous system runs right through the digestive system. So the digestive system will innovate in this scenario. And the other big thing I see in burnout, and quite often, you know, you see people in all stages of that burnout, is the hormonal changes. So it'll be men coming with extremely low testosterone, loss of libido, women coming with, you know, quite chronic depression that's driven by thyroid. So there's always the endocrine system gets involved as well.
Well, let's turn over to the suggestions and advice that we might be giving ourselves or giving to other people when we see that we're well and truly in this syndrome and we want to support them out of it. What are the sorts of things that they can do to bring health back?
Yes, well, I often talk to people just generally about what I call the 4 pillars of well-being, and just simply, you know, work is an important pillar for most people. Gives them a sense of meaning and purpose and status. The physical domain, and I'm sure, Reine, you'll be talking about that, but just the fundamentals around diet, exercise, and sleep. The social domain, their relationships, and finally, what a broad domain I just call an aesthetic sensibility. So this can be anything from nature appreciation through to the appreciation of art, spirituality, but this sense of being a part of something that transcends self. And generally what you find with these people, they're really out of balance across those domains. And everyone's going to have a different balance there. But I would typically start people at the physical domain, would be looking at their diet, exercise, and sleep, because, as you're saying, Reine, it's pretty obvious that things are really out of whack, that they're running on adrenaline and cortisol, and their sympathetic systems are in overdrive. And so getting them some sort of practices in that domain, but also very often they need a break. They just need a break from work. They need to be talking to people who are close to them and re-engaging the connection.
Very interesting you raise that, Chris, because I was sort of talking about this with Ren and saying, yeah, but what if they need to get going? What can they do? And Ren said, no, they need a break.
Yeah.
So
it's a really hard prescription. It's like, okay, you're just going to have to put things down for a little bit. It's probably the hardest hardest part of the prescription, I think, but I haven't found a way around it yet to try and keep people performing at a high level without there being just a pause in the stress.
Yeah, I mean, most of these people that I work with, they think they're completely indispensable, right? I mean, they're not. It's not easy for people to jump into the gap if they were to pause at work. Is they're on a big legal matter or there's a big transaction happening. But organisations always cope, right? If they were knocked over by a car,
exactly,
they'd cope. So it is because it's an exhaustion syndrome, right? It's and so but they have a lot of psychological fear of that, and their identity is very tied into always being able to cope, right? So getting to people to pause is no mean feat, because they will perceive it as a serious failure. Yeah.
I mean, just coming over to you, if someone came to your room and they're in your room and they know they're burnt out, what would be a part of your prescription process?
Well, I know that burnout isn't just a physiological, it's very psychological as well. So I usually build teams around these patients because they do need permission to stop as well. And they do need to really feel okay about that choice. But there's usually a discussion around that somewhere. Obviously, diet is massive, where once they would have tolerated things like gluten and dairy, probably now they're really driving the inflammation. And on a physiological level, burnout is a neuroinflammatory state. So anything that's going to douse inflammation in the system, especially inflammation of the nervous system. So getting their sleep right is absolutely pivotal. I do like CBD oil and THC. It's a beautiful neuro anti-inflammatory that can rescue sleep, but getting the circadian rhythm right as well. So that sleep-wake pattern, waking up at the same time every day, going to bed at the same time. And that's actually the harder part of the equation, is going to bed at the same time every day. Alcohol, where it is a bit of a handle to start with, actually becomes a big problem towards the end. So reducing alcohol, which that's hard, that usually needs some sort of counselling as well. And then addressing other bits. So if there's infection, quite often the immune system's dysregulated, and so you may need to address infection. I would often use intravenous nutrients, vitamin C with extra fluids. These patients are usually quite dehydrated. We can put magnesium in the intravenous. I would always use an integrative doctor as well, because we need to run bloods. We need to see what the thyroid's doing, the hormones, the adrenals, and acupuncture. If they've got to stay on the field, I would bring in modalities that can support that chi imbalance. So acupuncture, and the other one I love is craniosacral therapy. So I would usually use all of them.
So something I want to capture from that burnout as a health condition to grapple with requires a multifaceted approach. It sounds like that's really important. And a period of rest within that sounds really important as well. I'm conscious of time. I just want to mention in closing that, you know, there are other very demanding roles out there where people are at risk of burnout as well. And, you know, the research done through the University of New South Wales, you know, show people who are in high-level carer roles, whether that's for children or for the elderly, somebody who's looking after a sick partner or someone with disabilities, looking after someone with disabilities. So people in those very demanding roles where they're supporting others are very vulnerable to burnout as well. And as you mentioned, Chris, on the tail end of still really just the close of COVID, the impact of all of that just being crushed in together is still having an effect on us all. So I want to thank you both today for exploring this topic further, and I really hope for viewers out there it gives them a chance just to check in on themselves and where they're sitting with their health around the demands that they've placed on themselves. If they're not sure whether they're experiencing burnout or not, there is a questionnaire called the Sydney Burnout Questionnaire, which is really worth looking at. So I'll provide a link for that if you've got some questions about whether you're there or not. But thanks again to you both.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam.
No problem. Thank you. Bye.